August 19th, 1942. The air hung thick and heavy above the jungle near Taivu Point, Guadalcanal, a suffocating curtain of heat, damp earth, and the faint metallic tang of salt drifting in from the sea. Second Lieutenant Genjiro Imi of the 8th Independent Anti-Tank Gun Company sat hunched over a small field notebook, his pencil trembling slightly as he recorded his observations. He could not have known it then, but the words he wrote that morning would capture the quiet bewilderment of an army stepping unknowingly into history's turning point. Around him, the jungle whispered with the unseen movements of 916 men from Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki's detachment, soldiers hardened by years of conquest across China and Southeast Asia, now ghosts slipping through the undergrowth toward an enemy they had been told was weak, clumsy, and soft. Their landing under cover of night had been textbook precision, destroyers slipping away before dawn, leaving the soldiers to gather themselves in the tangled green silence. They had been promised an easy victory. Tokyo believed there were perhaps 2,000 Americans holding the island, poorly trained and easily frightened, the spoiled products of a decadent civilization. Ichiki himself had scoffed at the suggestion that he wait for reinforcements. "These are Americans," he had told his officers with a dismissive flick of the hand. "We will sweep them into the sea before sunrise." His men had nodded, because they believed him and because for 5 years they had never been wrong. Since 1937, defeat had been a foreign word to the Imperial Japanese Army. They had rolled through China, across the Philippines, down through Malaya, each campaign another chapter in an unbroken story of dominance. But here, beneath the towering palms of Guadalcanal, the pattern would fracture. What awaited them was not simply defeat, it was revelation. The battle to come would dismantle every cherished assumption, every deeply held belief that defined the Japanese way of war. Their faith in darkness, their mastery of night fighting, their conviction that courage outweighed machinery, all would turn against them. The jungle itself would become an accomplice of the enemy. The story had begun 12 days earlier, on August 7th, when 11,000 U.S. Marines of the 1st Marine Division came ashore at Lunga Point. Operation Watchtower, the first American offensive of the Pacific War, had begun in earnest. Their mission seemed almost naive in its simplicity: seize the airfield the Japanese were building, secure the perimeter, and hold until relieved. But those men stepping off Higgins' boats into surf and gunfire were entering a crucible that would test the limits of human endurance. Guadalcanal was no paradise. It was a narrow blade of volcanic land, 90 miles long, 25 wide, its spine a jagged wall of mountains climbing into a ceiling of unbroken clouds. The coast where Henderson Field sat was an open wound of kunai, grass, swamp, and jungle so dense that men vanished into it as if swallowed whole. The air itself pressed against the lungs, humidity never dropped below 90%. Mosquitoes came in clouds so thick they sounded like static. What looked from reconnaissance photos like clear rivers and inviting streams were filled with parasites. Men who drank from them paid in fever and delirium, malaria, dengue fever, dysentery. These would claim more Marines than bullets ever would. And yet, on that first day, luck seemed to favor the Americans. When they reached the airfield, they found it almost deserted. The 2,200 Japanese construction workers and 600 naval troops who had been building it had fled into the jungle, abandoning equipment, supplies, and the nearly complete runway. By nightfall on August 8th, the engineers were already at work, bulldozers growling in the dark, transforming the enemy's project into an American foothold. They named it Henderson Field for Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at Midway, a symbolic gesture linking two turning points of the Pacific. Within days, the first aircraft landed. Soon the island would host a collection of battered but relentless flyers known as the Cactus Air Force. But while the Marines built and the airmen prepared, the sea turned red. On the night of August 9th, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa led 7 Japanese cruisers and a destroyer into the narrow channels off Savo Island. The attack came out of blackness like a blade. In less than an hour, 4 Allied heavy cruisers, USS Quincy, USS Vincennes, USS Astoria, and the British HMS Canberra, were sunk, burning like pyres on the water. Over 1,000 sailors died before they even understood what was happening. The survivors described the sea as glowing, a reflection of their ship's flames and the phosphorescent trails of torpedoes cutting through the dark. When dawn came, the American fleet was gone. They had withdrawn, taking with them much of the supplies that had yet to be unloaded. On shore, the Marines woke to find themselves alone, cut off, undersupplied, and facing an enemy that now knew exactly where they were. Their food was limited, their ammunition scarce, but they held something the Japanese did not yet understand, an unshakable will. And in the distance, on a map in Tokyo, Henderson Field had become the eye of a storm. Whoever controlled it would control the surrounding seas by day. From its runway, American aircraft could strike any Japanese ship within 200 miles. That single fact changed everything. Japan could rule the night, running supplies aboard fast destroyers in what the Americans came to call the Tokyo Express. But when the sun rose, the skies belonged to the United States. The Imperial General Headquarters saw the urgency. Henderson Field had to be retaken immediately before the Americans could entrench themselves. The task fell to Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake's 17th Army, based at Rabaul. His resources were thin. The 35th Infantry Brigade was far to the west at Palau. The 4th Regiment was in the Philippines. Only one unit stood close enough to act. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki's 28th Infantry Regiment, stationed near Guam. Ichiki was no ordinary commander. Once an instructor at the Army Infantry School, he had earned a reputation for brilliance on the battlefield and for arrogance off it. He believed utterly in the supremacy of Japanese fighting spirit, the seishin, that could overcome any numerical or material disadvantage. Before departing Truk for Guadalcanal, he received direct orders: wait for the remainder of his regiment before advancing on the airfield. But Ichiki, flush with the confidence of a lifetime of victories, ignored them. Reports from earlier campaigns had taught him the same false lesson again and again, that Western troops lacked resolve. They broke when pressed. They lacked discipline. They feared close combat. So, on the night of August 18th, 6 destroyers slipped toward Taivu Point carrying 900-117 men, the first wave of Ichiki's force. The landing went smoothly, the jungle swallowing them whole. They believed they had the element of surprise. Ichiki immediately ordered reconnaissance patrols to probe the American perimeter, a decision that seemed routine, until it wasn't. At dawn on August 19th, a patrol from Company A, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, under Captain Charles Brush, moved east along the coastal track toward Coley Point. The air shimmered with heat. The surf hissed against the sand. And then, movement. Shadows flickered through the foliage. The Marines froze, then opened fire. The exchange was short, sharp, and brutal in its efficiency. When the noise faded, 31 Japanese soldiers lay still, and among their gear were maps and documents that told a story far bigger than the skirmish itself. Those papers revealed the presence of a significant Japanese force, far larger than expected, and, crucially, showed that Ichiki's staff believed they were facing only a token American defense. Captain Brush raced back through the heat, clutching the captured intelligence. When he reached headquarters, General Alexander Van de Grift read the documents and understood instantly. The attack was coming, and soon. He turned to Colonel Clifton Cates and gave the order: fortify the eastern perimeter. Cates deployed Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Cresswell's 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, along the mouth of a small river the Americans called the Tenaru, though in truth, it was the Ilu. They dug in behind machine guns arranged in interlocking fields of fire across a narrow sandbar. As night fell, the jungle seemed to hold its breath. What would follow in the hours before dawn would become one of the most one-sided battles in Marine Corps history. A clash not only of armies, but of faith, of two worlds colliding in the dark. The Americans waited, listening to the insects hum, the surf crash, and the faint sound of movement in the trees. Somewhere out there, Ichiki's men were coming, believing still that the jungle was theirs. And then, from the blackness, came the faint metallic sound of a bolt being drawn. The silence broke like glass. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki stood beneath the dripping palms, his uniform darkened with sweat and salt, the air around him trembling with the steady hum of insects and faraway surf. He had received no word from his missing patrol, no confirmation of enemy strength, and yet the silence itself seemed to mock him. Waiting was not his way. Patience, in his eyes, was weakness dressed as discipline. So, on the humid night of August 20th, carrying the unbroken confidence of a soldier who had never known defeat, he gave his order. The attack would begin before dawn, no delay, no hesitation. The sandbar across the Ilu River, what the Americans called the Tanaroo, would become the proving ground for the Japanese spirit. The doctrine that had carried the Imperial Army across Asia rested on one unshakable belief: that spiritual power, courage, unity, and the will to die without fear could overcome any technological advantage. Ichiki's veterans had seen this work time and again against Chinese troops, British garrisons, and American forces in the Philippines. They believed in the sanctity of the bayonet, in the clean finality of close-quarters battle. For them, the night was not an obstacle, but an ally. Beneath its cover, they had always been the hunters. But the jungle of Guadalcanal was a different creature. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. As midnight approached, a faint sound broke the tension. A man stumbling through the dark, barefoot, torn, his breath rasping. Solomon Island scout Jacob Vuza had escaped Japanese captors after hours of agony. He collapsed at the edge of the marine perimeter, gasping out a single warning: "They're coming." The words spread through the line like an electric current. Helmets shifted, bolts clicked, the soft metallic rhythm of men preparing for what they already knew could only end one way. Minutes later, the night exploded. From the far bank, hundreds of Japanese soldiers surged forward, voices rising in unison. The sound was primal, a roar that carried faith and fury in equal measure. Rifles fired in stuttering bursts. Grenades arced through the darkness like sparks from a forge. They charged straight across the sandbar, illuminated by the moonlight, unaware that every step forward drew them deeper into the geometry of an ambush. The Marines had prepared with almost mathematical precision. Interlocking fields of fire, overlapping arcs of defense, each weapon placed not just to kill, but to cover every inch of the crossing. When the first wave reached the midpoint, the stillness shattered. The M1917A1 Browning machine guns began their grim work. The water-cooled guns hissed and chugged, the barrels glowing faintly beneath the moon. These were relics of an older war, but in the hands of the Marines they sang with relentless accuracy, 600 rounds a minute, each one finding its place in the darkness. The sandbar became a storm of sound, metal tearing air, voices shouting in English and Japanese, the rhythmic mechanical pulse of fire, sustained without pause. The Japanese came on anyway, driven by belief more than reason. Some reached the far edge of the sandbar, only to meet the flat thunder of 37 WWII anti-tank guns loaded with canister rounds, hundreds of steel pellets spreading like invisible rain. The jungle itself seemed to recoil. For hours, the pattern repeated, waves of men advancing into the same curtain of fire, their courage meeting something colder and more calculated than they had ever faced. The Marines fought without frenzy. They fired, shifted, reloaded, fired again. the discipline of training blending with a grim understanding that survival depended on precision. Some Japanese soldiers reached the Marine lines, and in the brief chaos that followed, the night echoed with the sounds of close struggle, steel against wood, the muffled weight of human desperation. But the line held. By the time the first pale light of dawn touched the horizon, Ichiki's assault had dissolved into silence. The river ran slow and opaque, carrying with it the remnants of a broken force. Over 800 men of the 917, who had landed 2 nights earlier, lay still upon the sand or in the shallows, their courage unmatched but undone by the geometry of modern war. Ichiki's proud assault had become an echo lost in the morning mist. When the sun rose fully, the air shimmered with heat and the smell of cordite. General Vandegrift gave the order for a counterattack. 5 M3 Stuart light tanks, small, squat, their engines growling like caged beasts, rumbled across the same sandbar now littered with the scars of the night. They moved methodically through the coconut groves beyond, their guns sweeping left and right. From his position, war correspondent Richard Tregaskis watched the strange ballet unfold. Later, he would write that it was fascinating to see them bustling among the trees, pivoting, turning, spitting sheets of yellow flame. Through his binoculars, it seemed almost unreal. Men and machines moving through sunlight. The war momentarily stripped of its fury and reduced to a mechanical rhythm. By midday, it was over. Of the 917 men Ichiki had brought ashore, roughly 800 were dead. The few who survived, about 128, mostly from support units, had stayed near the landing site, too far to join the attack. They slipped into the jungle, stunned, carrying with them a single message to the 17th Army headquarters. The force had been annihilated. Among the dead was Colonel Ichiki himself. How he met his end remains uncertain. The official Japanese report claimed he burned his regimental colors and performed seppuku. Others swore he died charging forward, sword in hand. In either case, his life ended in the same conviction with which he had begun the battle, refusing to retreat. For the Americans, the cost had been small in comparison, 40 Marines killed or wounded, but the victory's significance went far beyond numbers. For the Japanese, the psychological wound was devastating. A regiment, men of proven valor and training, had been erased in a single night. Their faith in the supremacy of Seishin, of the warrior spirit triumphing over material strength, had shattered against the cold efficiency of modern firepower. Captured diaries and post-war testimonies revealed disbelief, shock at the precision, at the methodical calm with which the Marines fought. The Americans had not panicked, had not broken formation, had not yielded to the fear that Japanese doctrine assumed they would. Instead, they had waited, silent, patient, and then unleashed destruction with mathematical precision. It was not hatred that defeated Ichiki's men. It was discipline. Even the battlefield itself told the story. The Browning machine guns, old designs from another war, had performed flawlessly. They never overheated, never jammed, never faltered for lack of maintenance. Each Marine carried what seemed an impossible supply of ammunition, spare parts, and confidence born of a supply chain that stretched across oceans. The artillery that supported them, accurate, synchronized, and ready, spoke of an industrial machine far beyond Japanese comprehension. And from offshore, naval gunfire had answered Marine calls like thunder from the horizon. Every element, infantry, artillery, air, sea, had functioned not as separate parts, but as a single organism. In that sense, the Battle of the Tenaru was not merely a clash of soldiers, it was a collision of civilizations. One side fought with courage and faith, the other with coordination and inexhaustible material might. The difference was not moral, it was structural. The Americans fought as a system. The Japanese fought as men. Yet in Tokyo and Rabaul, there was no time to mourn. Within days, orders were already moving through channels. Reinforcements would be sent. Henderson Field would be retaken at any cost. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself began organizing a massive naval operation to support the next attempt. On August 16th, 3 transport ships left Truk carrying the remainder of Ichiki's regiment, about 1,400 soldiers and 500 naval infantry. But fate, once again, intervened. During the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, one of the transports was heavily damaged. The Japanese command, realizing how vulnerable slow-moving transports were to American aircraft, abandoned that method entirely. From now on, resupply and reinforcement would come by destroyers, fast, sleek, and deadly. These night operations would soon earn a name whispered with equal parts pride and dread, the Tokyo Express. Between August 29th and September 4th, destroyers and light cruisers ferried nearly 5,000 men from Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi's 35th Infantry Brigade to Taivu Point. They slipped through darkness, their decks washed in red light, carrying soldiers packed shoulder to shoulder. The Tokyo Express was a marvel of improvisation, swift, daring, efficient. But it carried a fatal flaw. Destroyers could not carry heavy equipment. No artillery, no tanks, no trucks, and worst of all, no substantial food or ammunition. What the soldiers brought was what they could carry on their backs. Every man carried not just his rifle, but the burden of scarcity. And that, more than any bullet, would be Japan's undoing. Logistics, as every veteran knows, is the quiet dictator of war. By early September, the Japanese buildup on Guadalcanal was complete. Kawaguchi, now in command, chose September 12th for his assault on Henderson Field. His plan called for a 3-pronged attack, one force striking from the west along the coast, another from the south through the thick jungle, and his main force descending along a ridge overlooking the airfield. To Kawaguchi, it was a sound plan, a masterstroke that would crush the Americans from multiple directions. But the Americans had learned fast. Marine intelligence, through reconnaissance and intuition, had already identified that ridge as the most likely avenue of attack. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt, Red Mike Edson, commander of the 1st Raider Battalion, had led a reconnaissance raid on Tasimboko village on September 8th. What he found there confirmed his instincts. Massive Japanese supply dumps hidden under palm fronds and tarps. There was no longer any doubt the Japanese would come from the south. Edson moved quickly. He requested permission to occupy the ridge, and General Vandegrift, understanding the significance, approved at once. On September 10th and 11th, 840 Marines, Edson's Raiders and the 1st Parachute Battalion, dug in among the trees and kunai grass. They positioned their machine guns to create overlapping arcs of fire. Mortars zeroed in on the likely approach routes. Artillery from the 11th Marines plotted defensive missions with cold precision. And then they waited. Night on Guadalcanal fell like a living thing, thick, wet, filled with whispers and distant motion. The ridge overlooked Henderson Field, and from its height, the Marines could see the faint glimmer of aircraft lights and the endless horizon of jungle beyond. Somewhere in that darkness, thousands of Japanese soldiers were moving toward them, silent but certain. The men on the ridge checked their weapons one last time, listened to the steady thrum of insects, and felt the slow rhythm of their own breathing. A distant rumble of thunder rolled across the island, low and long. It might have been weather, or something else. Every advantage of terrain and firepower had been measured out as carefully as a gunsmith checking a barrel. The ridge itself was nothing grand to look at in daylight, just a narrow coral spine, about 1,000 meters long, 3 humps of ground, covered in kunai grass and scattered wind-bent trees. But to an officer who'd seen the shape of battle before, it was obvious what it really was, a funnel. On both sides of that ridge lay deep, choked ravines, so tangled with tropical growth that even a single man had to push his way through. To the Japanese, that made it ideal for infiltration. Creep along the ravines, come up the sides, hit the Marines where they weren't looking. To the Marines, if they placed their guns right and kept their heads clear, it was something else entirely, a killing ground. And on the night of September 12, 1942, General Kiyotake Kawaguchi walked his men straight into it. This was not going to be another blind, proud rush like Ichiki's at the Tanaru. Kawaguchi was no fool. His plan was subtler, more in harmony with the classic strengths of Japanese night fighting. Instead of one hammer blow, he sent fingers, infantry squads, feeling their way through the ravines on both sides of the ridge, trying to crawl under and around the Marine positions. Small units probed for weakness, whispered to one another in the dark, then fell back to guide larger formations toward the places where the American line bent. It was clever, it was brave, and in any other war, on any other island, against any other enemy less dug in, it might have worked. But on Edson's Ridge, Bloody Ridge, as it would be called for the rest of the war, there were no unguarded places. The Marines had watched Japanese patterns for a month. They knew the enemy loved the night, loved to test the edges of a line, loved to come in close, where a bayonet or grenade could settle things in seconds. So they had prepared for exactly that. Mortar crews sat with firing data already written, illumination rounds ready, powder bags stacked. Machine gun teams had interlocking fields of fire, plotted out so finely that no patch of ground in front of the ridge was safe for more than a heartbeat. And the guns of the 11th Marines, American artillery, were already sighted in on every likely approach. All they needed was a target. The first Japanese groups came in low and fast through the ravines. In the pitch-black jungle, the fighting turned immediately into a tangle. Marines heard whispering, saw shapes where there should have been none, and sometimes fired at the sound of a branch snapping. In some places, the enemy got close, too close. In that breathing, sweating darkness, men grappled with men, swinging rifle butts, knives, even entrenching tools. But every time the Japanese tried to swell those infiltrations into a real breakthrough, every time a company gathered its breath for a charge, the night itself seemed to answer with American steel. Mortars thumped. Then, seconds later, explosions walked across the jungle like footsteps. The 11th Marines fired more than 2,000 rounds that night, high explosive shells coming down so near to the Marine lines that hot shards of metal wounded their own men. That was the level of confidence and the level of necessity. Better to risk friendly shrapnel than to let the enemy pour over that ridge and onto Henderson Field below. Machine gun crews fired until their barrels glowed a dull, angry red, steam and smoke mixing with the damp night air. Individual Marines, separated by darkness and confusion, fought with whatever was at hand. M1 rifles snapped and kicked, Colt pistols barked, knives flashed in quick arcs, and sometimes a man swung a shovel because that was what he had. Moving through this chaos was Sergeant Major Jacob Vuza, the same Solomon Islander whose warning had saved the Marines at the Tanaru. He walked the lines in the dark, steady, unhurried, pointing out the places where the Japanese were working their way in, telling the Marines in his quiet way to hold. And then there was Sergeant John Basilone, New Jersey-born boxer's jaw, the kind of Marine other Marines followed. His machine gun position sat right where the attacks thickened, where Kawaguchi's men seemed determined to break through if it killed them all. When his gun crews were hit, killed, wounded, dragged away, Basilone stayed. He fed ammo, cleared jams, shifted guns, and kept the Browning talking hour after hour. He fought until it was less like a battle and more like a test of human endurance. Just one man and a couple of water-cooled machine guns holding back a force that refused to believe Americans could fight like that at night. He would earn the Medal of Honor for what he did on that ridge, but on the night itself, there were no medals, only sweat and smoke, and the sound of men refusing to move. When the sun came up on September 13th, the Japanese attack had failed to break through. Bodies lay in the kunai grass, in the ravines, tangled in barbed wire, sprawled in the shallow scoops of dirt where Marines had taken cover. But Kawaguchi was not finished. He had more troops, and he knew, as every Japanese commander on Guadalcanal would learn, that if he did not break the Marines now, before more supplies came in, before the Americans thickened their lines and brought up more guns, he might never get another real chance. Edson understood that too. He pulled his units back to the center of the ridge, tightened the line, brought his raiders and parachute battalion into a shorter, stronger arc. General Van de Grift sent reinforcements. By the time darkness fell again, there were about 2,500 Marines defending that coral spine. The second night was worse. Kawaguchi threw everything he had left. This was no longer a confident infiltration. This was desperation in uniform. Japanese soldiers came up the ravines in clusters, sometimes in small, fiery rushes, sometimes in great heaving groups, yelling and pushing each other forward. They got closer this time, within 50 yards of Edson's command post. At one point, things were so tight, so uncertain, that Edson himself picked up a rifle and joined the line, firing into the dark with the men he led. That is not something generals like to do. That is something generals only do when the line is bending. But it never broke. Again, American firepower and preparation decided the night. The machine guns did what machine guns are meant to do. Mortars dropped rounds on coordinates that had been plotted hours earlier. Artillery behind the lines sent shell after shell to the exact spots the forward observers called out. And once more, the Japanese, brave, relentless, absolutely committed, ran into a wall that courage alone could not climb. By the morning of September 14th, Kawaguchi's offensive was ruined. Somewhere between 8:30 and 8:50, Japanese soldiers lay dead around what would forever be called Bloody Ridge. The Marines paid heavily too, about 104 killed and more than 200 wounded among the raiders and the parachute battalion. But they were still standing, and Henderson Field still belonged to them. For the Japanese who survived, this was the second terrible lesson of Guadalcanal. Tenaru could be blamed on arrogance, on Ichiki's refusal to wait, on his belief that numbers didn't matter when spirit was strong. But Edson's Ridge was different. This time they had used infiltration. This time they had used the jungle. This time they had attacked where it made sense, at night, on difficult ground, with units that understood close combat. And still the Americans had known. Still the Americans had prepared. Still the Americans had called down artillery with a precision that staggered men who had been taught that the United States was soft, mechanized, and slow to react. Captured diaries and post-war recollections speak of the same realization. The enemy did not behave as predicted. He did not crumble in darkness. He did not abandon positions when attacked from multiple directions. He did not fire blindly. He waited. He chose. Then he destroyed. From these two fights, Tenaru and Bloody Ridge, a pattern emerged that would repeat again and again across the jungle and riverbeds of Guadalcanal. Japanese forces would assemble, exhausted but determined, to launch night attacks built on courage, satiation, and the age-old trust in bayonet and grenade. American forces, often fewer in number and just as miserable in the climate, would meet them from positions dug, sandbagged, and pre-sighted, with mortars registered, artillery on call, and machine guns sighted, so that no man could stand in the open for more than a breath. The results, tragically, became predictable. Japanese casualties, catastrophic. American casualties, painful, sometimes severe, but ultimately sustainable. And in the background, beating like a dull drum, was the other enemy, one that cared nothing for courage or doctrine, the island itself. Guadalcanal punished all men equally, but it punished the Japanese harder. By December 1942, the 1st Marine Division would report over 8,000 cases of malaria. 2/3 of the division would be temporarily unfit for combat. Men's feet rotted in their boots. Fungal infections bloomed in the folds of skin. Dysentery became a daily humiliation. Teeth abscessed. Cuts refused to heal. And remember, these were the men with supply lines. These were the men with quinine, with medics, with field hospitals, with the chance of being evacuated to a rear area. For the Japanese, it was worse, much worse. Because of the Tokyo Express supply method, they arrived with rifles, but without enough food, without spare clothing, without proper medical supplies. What should have been a steady 3,000-calorie soldier's ration became scraped rice, a half-rotten coconut, whatever could be pulled from the jungle. Starvation was not a rumor. It was the taste in every man's mouth. By late October, Japanese medical officers were reporting that over 60% of the 17th Army on Guadalcanal was incapacitated by disease or malnutrition. Combat strength had dropped to 30%. Men were dying at the rate of 50 a day, not in battle, but simply because their bodies could not go on. On the American side, Henderson Field guarded the sea like a watchful hawk. When the sun was up, Japanese transports did not dare approach. That meant U.S. supply ships could bring food, ammunition, plasma, sulfa drugs, replacement parts, everything an army needs to keep breathing. There were shortages in August, yes. There were frightening days when the Navy pulled back and the Marines ate captured Japanese rice and counted rifle rounds. But those moments passed. By October, American logistics had found its rhythm. Marines ate K rations or C rations that, while no one would ever call them delicious, kept weight on their frames. Machine gunners could fire until their barrels wore down and then ask for new ones. Wounded men could be stabilized, operated on, and sometimes even sent home. The Japanese had no such cushion. What could not be lashed to the deck of a destroyer could not be brought. Artillery shells, vehicles, tanks, left behind. Quinine, gone. Bandages, rare. Ammunition, rationed to the point of absurdity. Men were ordered to fire only when targets were certain. Seriously wounded soldiers, those who in an American unit would have been tagged, carried to a rear line, handed to a nurse, were sometimes pressed a grenade and told to do what honor demanded. That was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. That was logistics, as merciless as any bullet. And that, more than any single engagement, is what Guadalcanal taught. That courage without supply is suffering. That doctrine without food is theory. That even the finest night fighters in the world cannot overcome empty stomachs, no quinine, and an enemy who can fly food in while you march hungry through the dark. On the ridge above Henderson Field, in those nights of September, the Americans proved something that would echo through the rest of the Pacific War. When you can feed your men, heal your men, and arm your men faster than the other side, the outcome is decided long before the first shot. Down on the slope, when the sun finally burned away the mist on September 14th, the ridge was quiet again, just wind in the kunai grass and the faint rumble of aircraft taking off from Henderson, heading north. By October 1942, the pattern on Guadalcanal was so clear that even men in the jungle, sick with fever and half deaf from artillery, could feel it without reading a single staff report. The side that could fly in bread and bullets in daylight would live. The side that could only slip in hungry men at night would bleed itself out. The Tokyo Express still came, fast destroyers racing down the slot under moonlight, bow waves glowing faintly, decks stacked with soldiers clinging to rifles and bedrolls. It was a feat of seamanship, almost romantic when you tell it years later, but it was never enough. A destroyer could bring men, yes, but it could not bring the heavy things that make men into an army: 105s, field kitchens, medical chests, radio spares, real rations. So Japanese troops kept arriving leaner, more exhausted, carrying everything they owned on their backs, stepping off into a jungle that offered them only mud, insects, and roots. Meanwhile, over that same jungle, in broad, arrogant daylight, American transports lumbered in under the protection of Henderson Field, circling down through humid air to land on a strip the Japanese had built and lost. Crates slid off, fuel drums rolled, stretchers were carried out, mail sacks tossed to grinning Marines. It was the quietest kind of victory, measured not in flags captured, but in calories delivered. Japanese diaries from that period, those that survived damp and retreat, say the same thing again and again in different hands. We attack bravely. The enemy shoots us down with artillery. We cannot get enough food. Malaria spreading. No medicine. You can hear the surprise in the kanji, even through translation. These were soldiers raised in an army that believed wool could beat steel, that a determined night assault could break any Western line. And yet, on Guadalcanal, they found something new. Americans who did not abandon positions when attacked from three sides, who did not throw away ammunition, but who could afford to fire as long as targets kept coming, who had radios talking to artillery batteries and artillery batteries talking to naval guns offshore. It was not individual heroism that broke the Japanese attacks, though there was plenty of heroism on that ridge and in those foxholes, but the harmony of it all. Infantry, mortars, 11th Marines guns, Cactus Air Force overhead. A system of war, not just men at war. As the campaign dragged into November, the jungle itself began to choose sides. The Americans, for all their sickness, could usually count on one thing. Sooner or later, another ship would arrive. It might be late, it might be battered, but it would come. They had quinine, at least in some quantity. They had sulfa drugs. They had field surgeons who could open a man's leg, pull out shrapnel, and keep him alive. And if a Marine's fever wouldn't break, he could be put on a plane and taken to a rear area hospital. Espiritu Santo, New Caledonia. Places that might as well have been different planets compared to the stinking riverbanks of the Matanikau. The Japanese had none of that. When quinine ran out, it ran out. When a man's wound festered, it festered. When a soldier could no longer walk, he became a burden to his unit. And in the grim calculus of a starving army far from its base, burdens could rarely be carried for long. That is the part of Guadalcanal people don't always like to dwell on, because it isn't the roaring, bayonet-charging kind of war. It is the thin kind. The kind where a soldier opens his ration bag and finds a single rice ball that has to last him the entire day's movement. Where officers send men to collect green papaya, taro, even grass, to boil into something that looks like food. Where orders are issued, quietly, almost apologetically, not to fire rifles except at certain ranges, because every cartridge has to be carried through miles of jungle on a human back. Imagine that. Men trained for the celebrated Banzai charge. Men brought up on the belief that the Emperor's soldiers never yield, suddenly told not to shoot unless they must, because a destroyer deck simply cannot carry enough ammunition. That is logistics, and logistics wins wars. American reports captured late in the campaign spoke of finding Japanese positions where men had died not in the act of assaulting, but simply folded. Malaria, dysentery, malnutrition. 3 silent allies working for the Marines without pay. By late October, a Japanese medical officer estimated that more than 60% of the 17th Army was incapacitated, and that the effective combat strength had dropped to about 30% of what the rosters said. In a force meant to hurl thousands of men against Henderson Field, fewer than a third were able to fight. And still orders came from Rabaul, from Truk, from Tokyo. Attack, retake the airfield, drive the Americans into the sea. The men on the island knew better. They could smell their own weakness, the sour breath of starvation, the heavy damp of untreated wounds. They were fighting the Americans and the calendar. On the American side, hardship was real but surmountable. Marines still got sick, thousands of them. The 1st Marine Division was a ghost of itself by December, not because of Japanese bullets, but because Guadalcanal ate men the way the sea eats ships. But when the Marines weakened, the U.S. Army arrived. When rations ran low, more rations were put on ships. When weapons wore out, replacements followed. This was the difference. When the Americans shot a machine gun until the barrel wore, they could ask for a new barrel. When a Japanese squad ran out of MG ammunition, the gun became B, dead weight. When an American went down with fever, he could often be evacuated. When a Japanese soldier collapsed, he was often left in a shelter with water and a grenade. The outcome on the battlefield was being decided not only at Edson's Ridge or along the Tenaru or in the Matanikau actions, but in warehouses in Noumea, in shipyards on the West Coast, in factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh that could send steel to the South Pacific faster than the Imperial Navy could run destroyers down the slot. That is why Guadalcanal matters. Not because it was the largest battle, it wasn't. Not because it was the bloodiest. It wasn't that either. It matters because it was the first time, in the Pacific, that Japanese soldiers confronted the full consequence of American industrial war, married to stubborn, disciplined infantry. Tenaru showed them that a night attack could fail. Bloody Ridge showed them that even a well-planned night attack could fail. The months that followed showed them something colder. Even if their tactics had succeeded, even if one of those attacks had actually broken through, they did not have the supply depth to hold what they took. It was like watching a man swing a beautiful sword on an empty stomach, skill without strength. Of course, Tokyo did not stop trying. Throughout October and into November, the Imperial Navy fought a series of savage night battles. Cape Esperance, the two naval battles of Guadalcanal, Tassafaronga, trying to break the American grip on Henderson Field. And here again, we see the same pattern we've been talking about. Tactically, Japanese destroyer crews and night-fighting cruisers were extraordinary. Again and again they hit hard, launched perfect long-lance torpedo spreads, and inflicted terrible damage on U.S. ships. But strategically, it did not change the fact that American aircraft could fly the next day, that Marines could still be supplied, that wounded could still be evacuated. The Japanese could win a night and lose the week. By late 1942, Japanese commanders on the spot began to send back messages that were more honest than the rhetoric in Tokyo. They reported shortages not in vague language, but in numbers. This many shells, this many bags of rice, this many men too weak to stand. They reported, too, the growing shock among their own troops at American staying power. The enemy's guns did not go silent after one engagement. His aircraft did not vanish after one bad day. His patrols did not melt away after taking casualties. This was not the China War. This was not Malaya. This was something else. A long, grinding contest in which the nation that could feed its fighters would eventually push the other into the sea. And that is exactly what happened. By January 1943, Japanese High Command, led by men who had once demanded that Guadalcanal be held at all costs, accepted the bitter truth. The cost had become too high. The Tokyo Express could bring brave men to die, but not the food to keep them alive. American control of Henderson Field meant daylight belonged to the United States. American submarines and aircraft made Japanese resupply costly even at night. Japanese soldiers were dying at the rate of dozens a day without the enemy even firing a shot. So a decision was made, quietly and with shame, to evacuate. The operation was given the dignified name K, pronounced K, a withdrawal. But every officer involved knew what it meant. The island that had once been called the key to the southern perimeter was to be abandoned. It is worth pausing on that because it tells you something deep about war. Japan did not leave Guadalcanal because its soldiers lacked courage. They had shown courage to the point of self-destruction. Japan did not leave because its officers were tactically inept. Many of the night attacks were well planned. Japan left because its logistics could not match America's. Because an island airfield, once captured by the Americans, could deny the surrounding sea to Japanese shipping in daylight. Because a destroyer deck cannot compete with a Liberty ship's hold. Because the longer the campaign lasted, the more it became a contest of stomachs and syringes, not swords and bayonets. For the Americans who stayed on the island to the end, Marines, then soldiers of the American Division and the 25th Infantry Division, the memory of Guadalcanal was not just gunfights and bayonet charges, though those were seared into their minds. It was also endless rain on ponchos, the smell of wet canvas, the faint medicinal odor of quinine, the constant buzzing of insects, the drone of Cactus Air Force engines taking off in 2s and 3s. They remembered the way a resupply ship appearing on the horizon could lift an entire regiment's spirits. They remembered the look of Japanese prisoners, thin, feverish, bewildered, that told them more about the enemy's condition than any captured map. And for the Japanese who survived the evacuation, pulled off beaches at night under American noses in one of the few flawlessly executed operations of the campaign, the lesson was even sharper. They had come to Guadalcanal to throw the Americans into the sea. They left knowing instead that the Americans had thrown a new kind of war at them, one where courage alone was not the trump card, a war where artillery talked to infantry, where aircraft protected supply, where a bottle of quinine was sometimes worth more than a rifle. So, when we talk about Guadalcanal, and if you're listening now on WWII History Tales, I know you feel this too. We shouldn't just remember the dramatic parts, the charging in the dark, and the Browning guns glowing red. We should remember the quieter verdict the island delivered, that modern war is won by those who can sustain the fight, by those who can feed men and fix them, not just inspire them, by those whose factories and farms can reach across oceans. On that narrow strip of jungle and coral, far from Berlin and far from Washington, the Pacific War quietly tilted because one side could keep sending full mess kits and replacement barrels, and the other could not. And when the last Japanese boats slipped away from the dark shoreline and the jungle closed over their old foxholes, the island did what islands always do. It went back to being green and wet and full of insects, while out on the runway, American engines wound up into that steady, confident roar. Even after the guns on Guadalcanal fell silent and the last Japanese boats slipped off the black water under Operation K, the verdict of that island stayed exactly the same. Japan had not been beaten because its soldiers lacked courage, but because courage by itself could not outrun aircraft, artillery, fuel, food, and a runway named Henderson. That was the hardest lesson for many imperial officers to accept, and it's where every honest post-war account by Japanese veterans begins. They said it in different ways, but the melody was always the same. We controlled the night, but the Americans controlled the sea and air. We had spirit, but they had systems. And systems, when they are complete, when they reach from the factory floor in Detroit or San Diego all the way to a muddy foxhole on a tropical ridge, will break even the fiercest warrior code. The Japanese officers who survived Guadalcanal admitted it later, with the tone of men who had carried pride across an ocean only to have it peeled away by reality. They had gone into the Solomons, convinced the Nihon Hei, the Japanese soldier, was superior to any American, tougher in training, more disciplined, more willing to die, more skilled at night fighting and close quarters work. For years, that belief had been confirmed in China, in Malaya, in the Philippines. Western soldiers had retreated. Asian opponents had folded. Japanese infantry had won battles with bayonet charges and perfectly timed infiltrations. But on Guadalcanal, for the first time, they ran into an enemy who did not fight the way their manuals predicted. American lines did not collapse when surprised at night. American defensive fires did not sputter out after a single volley. American officers did not hesitate to call artillery down within yards of their own positions. It was as if, on that island, every assumption of the old Japanese doctrine met the cold, square edges of industrial war and shattered. Veterans looking back described it almost with wonder. The Americans had a system for everything. That sentence comes up again and again, not said with hatred, said with respect, even with a little envy. There was a system for supply, ships in daylight, destroyers guarded by aircraft, beach dumps properly marked, fuel in drums, food in cans, everything numbered, everything recorded. There was a system for medical care, wounded men taken off the line, given plasma, sulfa, even evacuated to rear areas where malaria could actually be treated instead of endured. There was a system for artillery, forward observers with radios, well-drilled gun crews, fire missions answered in minutes, shells landing where they were supposed to land. There was a system for air coordination, Henderson Field launching fighters to cover convoys, SBD Dauntlesses and TBFs going after Japanese barges and supply ships, pilots flying multiple sorties a day from a dirt strip that should have been impossible to maintain in that climate. Every piece functioned. Every piece supported the others. Japanese systems, by contrast, failed not because Japanese soldiers were lazy or cowardly, but because those systems had never really been built to bear that much weight. They were designed for short, fast, decisive operations. Blitzkrieg's Pacific cousin, where the enemy would be shocked and overrun before supply became an issue. On Guadalcanal, supply was the issue, and Japan's system cracked. The technical side of it is worth saying out loud because it mattered every single night men were dying under the rainforest canopy. Japanese infantry were mostly armed with Arisaka bolt-action rifles, tough, reliable weapons, but slow. After every shot, work the bolt. After every shot, lose the sight picture. Early Marine units on Guadalcanal still carried M1903 Springfields, which were also bolt action, but as Garands filtered in, the M1, 8 rounds, semi-automatic, gas-operated, the firefights began to tilt. A Marine could fire again without breaking his rhythm. And when you multiply that by a platoon, by a company, the volume of fire becomes something the attacking side has to walk into. Machine guns widened that gap. The American M1917A1 Browning, water-cooled, heavy, not pretty to carry, but once emplaced, it could stay in the fight as long as the water jacket was topped up and ammunition belts kept coming. It was made for exactly the kind of defensive battle Guadalcanal became. Hold this line no matter how many times they hit it. Japanese Type 96 and Type 99 light machine guns were good for fast-moving infantry work, but they could not sit there and pump out sustained fire all night. On a dark ridge, that difference was decisive. Then there was artillery. The 11th Marines brought in their M1A1 75mm pack howitzers, clever little guns that could be broken down, hauled through jungle, and put back together again. Once in place, they gave the Marines what the Japanese lacked: responsive, accurate, repeatable fire. Infantry could spot a concentration coming through a ravine and, with a radio call, have shells landing there in minutes. That meant every Japanese buildup turned into a Japanese casualty list. Japanese artillery, by contrast, arrived late, arrived in small quantities, arrived without enough shells. Their guns were hard to drag through the mud, and once positioned, the ammunition stocks were so thin that officers had to choose carefully when to fire. Every time an American unit called for naval gunfire, destroyers and cruisers offshore throwing in high explosive, guided by radio from the beach, that gap widened. The Japanese had nothing like that on Guadalcanal. Their navy was good, brilliant even, at night surface fighting. But they could not stand offshore in daylight and support their ground troops because Cactus Air Force would punish them for it. Air power finished the picture. The men of the Cactus Air Force, Marine, Navy, and Army pilots, flying F-4F Wildcats, P-39 Airacobras, P-40 Warhawks, SBD Dauntlesses, operated from a miserable, muddy, bomb-cratered field, often with damaged planes, often half-sick themselves. But they flew. They intercepted Japanese bombers coming down from Rabaul, who were already at the edge of their range and had almost no time over target. They hit Japanese supply barges, troop concentrations, and the very destroyers trying to keep the Tokyo Express alive. and every Japanese pilot who returned to Rabaul with ripped wings and no bomb load told the same story. As long as Henderson stands, we cannot feed our men. That is why, when General Alexander Patch finally launched his coordinated American offensive in January 1943, with Marines and Army divisions working together, with artillery lined up, with air overhead, with naval guns watching the coast, the Japanese could do almost nothing to stop it. They fought. Of course they fought. But they were starving, fevered, short of ammunition. And Patch's men were not. On February 9th, 1943, American patrols found the Japanese gone, evacuated, slipped away under cover of night, leaving only footprints in the sand and broken equipment in the jungle. Patch sent the message to Admiral Halsey. Tokyo Express no longer has terminus on Guadalcanal. 6 months of brutal, grinding, no-glory fighting, and that was the line that said it was over. For the Americans, this first true ground victory against Japan was more than a tactical win. It was a psychological unshackling. The myth of Japanese invincibility, the idea that the enemy was somehow superhuman in the jungle, unbeatable at night, immune to pain, was gone. Marines and soldiers could say and believe, "We stood our ground and beat them. We can do it again." They had proved that American defensive doctrine worked in the Pacific, that combined arms, infantry, artillery, air, naval gunfire, could stop even the most determined night assault. They had proved that American small unit leaders could adapt, improvise, and hold under pressure that would have smashed lesser formations. But they also came away with something else: respect. Almost every American who fought on Guadalcanal would later say the same thing. Japanese soldiers were tough, disciplined, and absolutely committed. They attacked when they had no chance. They starved quietly. They chose death over surrender. That left a mark on U.S. troops, a kind of grim admiration. Yet from the Japanese side, the lesson went deeper and darker. Many of the men who survived, men later captured, or who endured to 1945 and then spoke to historians, said that Guadalcanal was where they first felt the war tilt away from Japan. Not at Midway, which was abstract to an infantryman, not at Coral Sea. On Guadalcanal in the mud, with a stomach that growled all night, with malaria shivering through their bones, watching American planes fly and American guns fire day after day. That was when they knew. They began to understand what some staff officers like Colonel Masanobu Tsuji tried to warn. Japan was trying to beat a continental-scale industrial power at an industrial war. The Americans were fighting with factories, farms, shipping, and standardized procedures. Japan was fighting with valor and doctrine created for campaigns in China. Those two things do not weigh the same on the scale. Official Japanese explanations after the campaign blamed the usual list: insufficient supplies, setbacks at sea, stronger than expected enemy. But they did not, could not, fully admit that the doctrine itself was obsolete. That night, attacks and shock tactics, brilliant against a disorganized Chinese force or an unprepared colonial garrison, would fail against an enemy who could see in the dark with flares, who could talk to artillery, who could feed his men. That the entire theory of winning through Seishin, spiritual power, had limits when the other side could put 3,000 calories and a clean bandage into a man every single day. That what had worked from 1937 to 1941 was never going to work against the United States of America in 1942. And there was one more harsh contrast. On Guadalcanal, American forces tried, imperfectly, sometimes clumsily, sometimes with suspicion, to get Japanese soldiers to surrender. They dropped leaflets. They used loudspeakers. They promised food and medical care. They treated the few prisoners they got. But very few came in. Out of roughly 36,000 Japanese troops who served on Guadalcanal, fewer than 1,000 were captured alive, and most of those were too sick or wounded to keep fighting. That fact told both sides something. It told the Americans they were dealing with an enemy whose military culture made surrender nearly impossible. And it told the Japanese that even in defeat, their society and the American society were playing by different moral rules, one that valued survival and one that valued endurance to the point of disappearance. So when you strip it down, what did Guadalcanal prove? It proved that war in the 1940s was no longer won only by the sharpness of the bayonet or the will of the infantryman. It was won by systems that could feed, supply, evacuate, coordinate, and replace. It proved that air and sea control decide what happens on land. It proved that logistics isn't the boring part of war. It is the war once the first rush is over. And it proved, in the saddest way for the men in Rising Sun headbands, that courage cannot fill an empty belly. Those Japanese veterans said it plainly decades later. We fought bravely. It did not matter. The Americans fought with organization and abundance. That did matter. And in the memory of those who were there, the island settles into a single picture, not the clash of charges, not even the roar of the SBDs, but the steady rise of American shells and supplies coming in. While in the jungle, men in faded khaki uniforms counted out their last rice grains and listened to engines they could never silence, engines that kept turning over above Henderson Field. The strategic implications of Guadalcanal rippled far beyond that strip of steaming jungle, and every officer who studied it afterward, whether in Washington or Tokyo, understood it. Some admitted it openly, others only in private notes, but the meaning was clear. When Japan failed to retake Henderson Field and then chose evacuation over persistence, the outer ring of the so-called defensive perimeter was no longer a wall. It was a screen that could be pushed aside. Once that happened, Allied thinking changed. No more holding actions, no more clinging to Australia and Hawaii, and hoping the next blow wouldn't come. Guadalcanal proved that American industrial power, when it was organized, protected by air, and fed across the ocean by convoys and carriers, could pierce the Japanese shield and stay pierced. From that moment, the initiative in the Pacific did not slowly drift. It snapped out of Japanese hands. For Japan, whether they said it or not, Guadalcanal was the beginning of the end, because it revealed something their planners had always feared but had hoped to outrun. They could not replace what they were losing, not at the speed America could. Pilots, destroyer crews, infantry veterans who knew how to move in jungle. They went down in those 6 months, and Tokyo could not grow them back. America, with its shipyards at full roar and its training bases churning out new Marines, new air crews, new Liberty ships, simply built another wave. That is what attritional war does. It favors the side that can keep filling the line. And in 1942 to 43, in the middle of the Solomons, the side that could keep filling the line was not Japan. Men carried Guadalcanal inside them for the rest of their lives. American Marines and soldiers who staggered off that island in December 1942 looked half dead, malarial, gaunt, uniforms hanging loose. Yet those were the men the U.S. Army and Marine Corps treated like gold. They became the instructors, the cadre, the ones who could tell a green unit in New Caledonia or on Efate, "No, you don't string the wire like that. No, you don't put a machine gun there. No, you don't ignore malaria discipline because the fever will take more of you than the enemy." The 1st Marine Division, evacuated to Australia, needed months to recover, months of quinine, of rest, of rebuilding equipment. But when they came back as veterans of the hardest school the Pacific had yet offered. Every later success in New Georgia, Bougainville, Cape Gloucester, all the way through the Solomons chain, carried fingerprints of Guadalcanal, interlocking fields of fire, air-ground radio nets, priority on building and protecting an airstrip, ruthless attention to supply dumps, and a hard, unromantic respect for the jungle as a killer equal to the enemy. For the Japanese survivors, the road forward was colder. The men lifted out under Operation K in early 1943, pulled off the beaches at night in destroyers running blacked out and fast, were not returned home as conquering heroes. They were redistributed, parceled out to other island garrisons that were now, one by one, shifting from offense to delaying defense. They carried with them a story their superiors did not like to hear. The Americans are much stronger than we were told. These were men who had watched American artillery arrive on call, had seen airplanes fly every day from Henderson, had buried friends who died not in glorious charges, but in slow, dry starvation, because the Tokyo Express could bring bodies, but not rice. They were sent to New Georgia, to Kolombangara, to New Britain, and many of them never saw Japan again. Guadalcanal had taken their health, their friends, and, this was the part hardest to admit, their certainty. Even the island remembered. For years, for decades, Guadalcanal was a graveyard of metal and memories. Locals and visiting servicemen could still find the skeletons of SBD Dauntlesses in the jungle. Their wings rotted away, but their frames recognizably American. Japanese landing craft rusted out on tidal flats. Wrecked M3 Stuarts swallowed by vines. Unexploded shells sunk in mud. Henderson Field, which had begun life as a half-finished Japanese strip hacked out by construction troops, became a permanent Allied base, extended, drained, and rolled, a jumping-off point for the rest of the Solomons Drive. In staff colleges later, in Quantico and Leavenworth, Guadalcanal was taught not as a romantic battle but as a workbook. This is how you do amphibious lodgment. This is how you hold when the fleet must temporarily withdraw. This is how you integrate Marine fighters with Navy ships and Army artillery. This is how you keep a division alive in a climate that wants to rot it from the feet up. The numbers, when you line them up, have no poetry in them, but they tell the scale of the thing. More than 7,000 Americans, sailors drowned or burned in the slot, Marines shot on ridges or laid low by disease, dead. Japanese losses from every cause on and around the island, combat, disease, malnutrition, naval battles, airstrikes, well over 30,000. Around the island at sea, more than 7,000 from both navies, gone in a handful of savage night fights. Thousands more on both sides carried malaria, dysentery, jungle rot as permanent souvenirs. And yet, when the admirals and generals weighed it, they called the price justified because Guadalcanal flipped the map. It was the first time the U.S. had seized ground from the Japanese and held it. It proved to allies, to enemies, to hesitant people back home, that Japan could be stopped, pushed, and eventually rolled back. After Guadalcanal, every offensive in the Central and Southwest Pacific could be planned with more confidence because the template existed. Secure an airfield, use it to cover the sea, starve the enemy of reinforcement, then grind him down. At its heart, the story of Japanese troops running headlong into American jungle warfare on Guadalcanal is a story about two ideas of war colliding. One idea said, willpower is everything. If the soldier is strong enough in spirit, he will close with the enemy and win, even if the enemy has more guns. Night attacks, close combat, the bayonet, the sudden shout in the dark. This was the Japanese way, refined in China, and believed with religious intensity. The other idea said, war is a system. You gather industrial power. You ship it forward. You protect it with air and sea. You land it, you feed it, and then you let rifles, mortars, howitzers, and radios express what your factories already decided. Guadalcanal was the place those two philosophies met on equal ground. No roads, no cities, no rail nets, just mud, trees, and men. And the outcome, after 6 long months, was not ambiguous. When logistics and concentrated fire support are present, courage alone will die tired. Japanese soldiers who lived through it said they felt something more frightening than enemy bullets. They felt the futility of courage in the face of an enemy who did not run out. That was the terror they remembered, and it was different from the fear of death. Japanese training taught them not to fear death. Many had made peace with dying in battle. What they had not been prepared for was to fight day after day, knowing that no matter how bravely they attacked, the Americans would still have food that night, still have shells, still have planes. They wrote afterward that it was terrifying, not because of explosions, but because it made them feel small inside a much larger machine. When you are a warrior in a warrior culture, and you realize your opponent is not a single warrior, but an entire civilization moving in unison, that realization breaks something. On the American side, the lesson ran in a more hopeful direction. Guadalcanal confirmed that if you train the infantry well, arm them well, support them well, and then keep supporting them no matter what the weather or the shipping losses, they can beat an enemy everyone said was unbeatable. It proved that American industry was not just the number in a magazine. It could be turned into crates on a beach, into fuel in a drum, into a spare machine gun barrel for a gun that had burned out during a night attack. It proved that air power, even from a rough coral strip, could dictate who owned the sea. And it proved that combined arms, infantry, artillery, air, naval gunfire, was not a European luxury, but the only sane way to fight in the Pacific too. This is why Guadalcanal sits the way it does in the memory of the Pacific War. It is the hinge. Before it, Japan expanding, taking, deciding when and where to fight. After it, Japan reacting, reinforcing too late, trying to hold lines that could no longer be held. From that jungle campaign onward, the Japanese army was almost always on the back foot, trying to defend too many islands with too few supplies against an enemy whose material advantages grew month by month. American planners knew it. Japanese survivors feared it. The pattern they had seen on Guadalcanal, American planes in the day, American shells at night, American supply dumps getting bigger instead of smaller, would show up again on New Georgia, on Bougainville, in the Gilberts and Marshalls, on Saipan and Peleliu, all the way to Okinawa. The terrain changed, the tactics adapted, but the underlying truth did not. You can fight an industrial power bravely. You cannot fight it cheaply. In the end, Guadalcanal became one of those rare battles that taught both sides more than tactics. It taught Japan that a nation waging an industrial, maritime, aviation-heavy war cannot be defeated by a doctrine written for continental short-range, make-do campaigns. It taught America that its own great strengths, factories, farms, shipyards, engineers, were not background music. They were the main instrument. And it left on that island, in the humidity and the quiet, after the last shell burst, a single, stubborn image, a rough airstrip shimmering in the heat, American planes lifting off one after another, while out in the jungle, half-healed foxholes and abandoned Japanese packs lay where hunger and exhaustion had finally won. And the jungle began, slowly, to close over them.